program begins. This is where we send the kids out and it gets real. I was very suspicious when I was a Christian of why they wouldn't let the kids into service. Oh, the other thing that happened to me, I think I've told you this story before. We had a hamster in our kindergarten Sunday school room when I was a little boy, and we were feeding it carrots. And so I was in Sunday school. My mom was in, my dad and mom were in the sermon, like I mentioned, because they would split. And while we were feeding the hamster a carrot, I stuck my finger in the cage. And the hamster bit my finger bad. And blood was just gushing out. And one of the teachers had to go to the cathedral and open the door. And my mom told me later, she was sitting there with my dad going, oh God, please don't let it be me. Please don't let it be me. I just don't want to be embarrassed. And they came in and they go, are there any parents for John Turner here? We've had a hamster emergency. And my mom had to get up in the middle of service and go and save me. And I tell people, I think that was the first day I realized I was a Buddhist. Because I've never been bit by any Buddhist animals, only Christian animals. That's a true story. It's one of those famous stories that get told every Thanksgiving and Christmas. So I was looking through quotes I could find on the importance of listening. And in our service book, the selected sayings, we have quote 26, 27, 28, and they're all by Renyo. He's kind of the second main founder of Jodo Shinshu around the time of Christopher Columbus. So Eastern people love that metaphor because Japan's been around forever, right? And America, at the time of Renyo, Christopher Columbus was landing in America. So, like sometimes people will say, oh, the Western people brought this to Japan. And it's like, we were a full-blown civilization and you had Christopher Columbus landing for the first time. And he was so mixed up, he called them Indians because he thought he was in India. They didn't know that the northern and southern hemisphere of the Americas was in between Europe and India if you sail west. So I highlighted the part that's really important. So Renyo actually gives us advice. He writes these letters to Sangha members. There are those who listen to the teachings with the purpose of showing off their knowledge to others, but few are those who listen for the sake of attaining awakening. Those who hear that the Pure Land is a place of pleasure and thus desire rebirth there shall not attain supreme enlightenment. Only those who place their being in Amida Buddha shall attain Buddhahood. And then from the standpoint of endowed trust, one should listen to the teachings as if it was for the very first time, even though it has been heard before. People want to hear new and interesting things all the time, but no matter how often one listens to the teachings, one should hear it as if it was a rare first occasion. So, we talk about Sachi Ochiai a lot. I think she just had her 100th birthday. Yeah. She would come to I would teach Introduction to Buddhism, right? And this was like 10 or 15 years ago when I just started practicing. So, I really don't know that much, and she knows a lot. But she came to every intro class I ever taught, or anyone taught. It didn't matter. When the BEC pamphlet came out, she would just take every class every quarter. And she would always hear something new and different, even though it's the same stories, but she would hear it with fresh ears and she would get deeper meaning out of it. And she helped me a lot because I was maybe learning Buddhism. I was trying to show off my knowledge when I taught intro. I was new and I was a little insecure. And I was using a lot of big Buddhist philosophical terms. And one night I said, oh, there's another big philosophical term I'm going to share with you. And I was about to write it on the board and I heard Sachi go, no, stop doing that. We don't need big words. We don't need big, complicated words. Just explain it in your own voice. And I was like, time stood still, right? The room got dark and there was a white spot on me and I went, ugh. So I totally changed the way I taught from that night on. I explain it in English and I'm not trying to impress people with like how many long Sanskrit words I know. So she really was like a Zen master for a lot of people. And then the other one is listen to the Buddhist teachings, even if you must take time out from your daily business. To believe that you will listen when you have some spare time is shallow thinking. There is no tomorrow in listening to the teachings. So this happens a lot, right? I'll study later. This happens a lot with retirement. I'll live my life. I'll start living my life when I'm 50, or I'll start doing what I want to do when I'm 60. And it's ironic, right? You don't want to wait to begin your life. And there's a Chinese Buddhist master. I don't know who he was, and I don't know exactly why he said this, but he said that Western people are always waiting to begin their life, right? We're always waiting to start something. So, like for me, Buddhism is important enough that I made it a priority on Sundays, right? Like I have to be able to give up 2 hours a week for Buddhism, right? Like I do hundreds and hundreds of hours doing everything that's non-Buddhist, but I kind of preserve that Sunday morning, is kind of sacred and precious. And you have to make it a priority. So the next thing I want to tell you about is there's a video on YouTube called Everybody's Waiting to Talk About Them. I did this a lot. So when I talk to people, I'm not really listening to you. I'm just thinking about how I can interject and say something super interesting. So, when you start talking about your dog, I kind of tune you out and go, okay, I have a dog. What's my best story about my dog? And then I wait for you to take any kind of breath, and then I interrupt. And so we do this a lot. One of my friends at work, this is a quote, not from the Buddha, but from one of my friends at work. He went to a meeting once, and he came back, and I said, well, how did it go? He was representing the technical side, and he was talking to managers, and I'm on the technical side. I said, well, how did the meeting go? Were you able to convince them about the right approach? And he said, we were not really having a conversation. We were merely speaking alternately. So they would talk, and then I would talk, but we weren't listening. There was no conversation going on. We were just both asserting things they made no progress. The meeting was a waste of time. So I want to share you this video from YouTube. It has millennials in it, but we do it all the time as adults. It's very difficult to stay focused and really listen to what somebody's saying and really trying to figure out not necessarily the words they're using, but the tone of voice, their expression on their face. I do this a lot with my daughter. So I listen to her and I read her, and a lot of times I'll say, how are you doing? And she'll say, oh, I'm fine. And I'm like, okay, what's wrong? She's not fine. So listening is more than just language. It's the way it's said, the look in the face. So here we go.
Palm Springs is just so beautiful. I mean, it's hot, but it's like a dry heat. And anyway, we spent most of the weekend just lounging by the pool.
Oh, hanging out by the pool. That reminds me of my belly flop story. Can't just start telling it now, though. I'll just think about it until Siobhan finishes talking.
Completely naked.
That reminds me, last summer I was house sitting for my Uncle Danny Elfman.
Oh, Summer! Oh, they're gonna love my Cancun food poisoning story. God, it's so good. I can't believe we're wasting all our time on Zach's boring story instead. Why are you still talking? There.
Steven Spielberg himself was there.
Cool, I have a story about Cancun and eating tacos there in the summer.
That reminds me of the time I drove the taco truck to California.
So then I woke up in a hospital next to Keith David.
Good, I have a story.
Oh, you go ahead.
No, you go.
Stop it!
Okay, quit talking. Stop, it's my turn.
Finish now! Be done! Finish now!
Okay, I'm just gonna go. So it just...
Fuck!
I had just landed in New York City.
New York! Me story! Me, New York story! Me!
Wait! Me though! Me Taco story! Me!
There were 17 bodies found in this.
Great, so I have a story about New York City.
No! Me!
Me. Sorry to interrupt. Did you guys say Emily?
No! but it was a wrap.
Me, Emily.
Filled it up, and that's how I won the key to the city and the key to my wife's heart.
Going back a few stories, I had a Choco Taco party.
I thought that was funny. So, that's another thing. So, not gossiping, focusing on the other person, not trying to interrupt with an even better story. I think Reverend Rada talked about this with Gail, but, it's a big deal to listen to your wife, right? Like they'll say, what did I just say? Like she just said it. And I'm like, and I'll try to guess. So, really connecting with people and listening is a very important practice. A lot of times when we give Dharma talks, I've noticed too, people will notice something and then it takes their focus away from the talk. So like people will tell me, oh, your tie really matched your Nenju today. That was great. But I don't think they heard my Dharma talk because they hyper focus on something and they didn't hear the talk. Like once that happens, they don't hear the talk. So sometimes little things will set us off and we don't hear. And then the other thing is, we really want to hear for ourselves. It's very personal. It's something that we apply to ourselves. It's not meant to be an academic, intellectual talk. And also Buddhism's not trying to present a philosophical structure or a new way of managing society. It's not really making an overarching type of presentation like that. So it's very down to earth and it's very personal. So I wanted to mention the two things that happen to me fairly often, but they haven't happened here that much, is when I give a talk or I read something from the internet, I'm bringing it so that we can listen to a different perspective and a different point of view, and it helps us self-reflect. But it's not a matter of agreeing with it, right? The whole reason I'm bringing it is it's something to challenge us and to make us think. But when I read one of these once in a while, especially people new to Buddhism, they'll raise their hand and they say, well, I don't agree with that. And I don't think they listen to the paper, and it ends the conversation and the dialogue. And it's not about agreeing, right? It's about hearing a new way of looking at it. And then the other thing that happens is if they do agree, then they don't take it personally. They take it kind of as an abstract ideal. And they'll say, and this is the one that bothers me the most, they'll say, what about Hitler? And I'm always like, what? So I think what they're saying is with this philosophy of change the outcome of Western Europe in the 1930s, I don't know. But it's really about something for you to practice, something very personal. It's not making a general statement. I mean, I think maybe they find the worst case scenario and they want to know if it'll work for Hitler. But I mean, I only care if it works for me. That's the important question, is will it work? And so, and the other thing that I've noticed is there's Buddhism and yoga, and I think they have a lot more in common than we like to think. I think they're the same activity or endeavor. It's a practice that's transformative. But yoga has been interpreted or characterized as an exercise. So Linda gets a lot of how questions because it's an exercise. And they never make her bring out a whiteboard and kind of justify the practice. She's the teacher, and they kind of have faith and confidence, and they ask lots of how questions. But the bad thing about that, because it's an exercise, yoga is losing its deep spiritual meaning. It's becoming about calories and waistlines, and so that's the downside of it being an exercise. Now in Buddhism, we've been considered a religion, one of the world's religions. And this is another Dharma talk, but that's a construct. That was something that's been kind of invented as a category. And for better or worse, we made it in to the World Religion Club. along with Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism. But because we're a religion, I get mainly why and what. Like, why do we do this? What are we doing? What are we doing it for? We rarely get how questions. We rarely get practice questions because we think of it as a doctrine or a set of beliefs. And it's really much more like yoga in terms of practice. So that's another issue that goes on. I think we're not kind of contextualizing. So now when I bring an essay about how to deal with loved ones who have cancer, or how do you comfort people who have died, I try to explain that, this is for our own self-reflection, and we're trying to learn from it and see if any of it applies to us. And also, you may not do any of the mistakes that this one article talked about on dealing with people who were ill, but it's possible maybe you were ill and people said things to you that weren't mindful. And if you understand where they're coming from and maybe why somebody might say that, it doesn't sting as much, and you have a little bit more compassion, and you kind of understand they might have kind of awkwardly said something, but they were trying to help. And so those are the reasons why we kind of read essays that we almost purposely don't agree. And then there's a famous quote by Zen Master Dogen. He said that if Buddhism turns out to be as you imagined it to be, then it's a very dubious form of Buddhism. So Zen Master Dogen saying it's actually good if it turns out not to be as you expected, because now you're beginning to appreciate it in an authentic way, and it's challenging you in ways that you'd never imagined. And the only way we can really do that is to listen really carefully. And the one last thing I wanted to mention about listening is when I first came to OCBC, I did this thing called concept matching, where I matched everything in Buddhism with something in Christianity. And I was constantly translating what Reverend Harada said from Buddhism into Christianity, and then I would think of a Christian question, and then I would translate it back into Buddhism. And it took me about 4 years before that two-step process fell away. And one day in the Kodo, I remember during adult study, I realized I was finally fluent. I was hearing it in Buddhism, I was thinking about it as a Buddhist, and I was articulating it with my questions as a Buddhist. That intermediate Buddhism, Christianity, Buddhism translation step has finally fallen away. But it took 4 years of listening for me to become fluent in the language of the Buddhist. So any thoughts or comments? And you cannot say, I don't agree with what you just said, and what about Hitler? That you cannot. So you're supposed to say, oh, we only do listening here. We don't do talking. Thank you.
In regards to the waiting for your chance to speak, that reminded me of a time that I was out with my friend, and we were having lunch, and he stopped me and he said, before you leave, I just wanted to share that I thought we were coming here to talk about me, but you've talked about yourself this entire time.
Right.
And I said, oh, thank you. And it actually ended up being really positive because he was able to share how he feels he needs to be asked by the person, kind of like pulled out. And I'm used to just waiting for a person to share their point. And he thought that he would have just left lunch and just kind of resented me. But then he thought, no, this is a friend. I should share with him how I feel. And it meant a lot to me to hear that. So yes, if I ever do that in any of our conversations, please let me know that you've been talking about yourself for quite a bit. And
Okay, good.
thank you.
Good, thank you, John.
That's a really good, and glad you shared that, because like it reminds me of the fact that you guys have a good enough of a friendship to where he felt comfortable enough to say to you that he felt that way, and then you felt like it was a positive experience. But I find too many times people aren't necessarily that open with you, and whether we like to do it or not, whether it's because of different cultural implications that come with the language in every language, or also just like kind of emotional experiences where we have, different associations with different words or different expressions. Sometimes I can find people can misunderstand me, or I can misunderstand them, and all of a sudden I'm thinking, oh no, they're trying to subtly belittle me, or I don't understand what they're saying. And so one thing that I learned recently in the last year is to just ask a little bit more questions for clarification, to check in. And something I'll like to start with is like, oh, so what did you mean by that? Did you mean, and then blah, 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 because there's so much that can be, lost in translation. And oftentimes people don't always necessarily feel comfortable enough to tell us what they're really feeling, if they didn't like something they said, and then it can be like this really not so good thing. But if we checked in a little bit more for clarification, and I don't always do it, because sometimes I'm not going to be, I'll be honest, there are sometimes I just think some people are super happy being willfully ignorant, and they don't, for whatever reason, they may not be in a place to want to listen to another alternative. And so I can sometimes sense that, and maybe I should try to be a little nicer and maybe ask them. But I do find that, more oftentimes than not, it helps to ask, what did you mean by that? Or something else to clarify.
Yeah, that's very constructive. Thank you.
Do you think it would be important sometimes to think as everyone, adults and children, just as being in a learning stage, kind of like children, where we can be more patient and really, pay attention to what's going on, because there may be something there that we're not familiar with and that, as you say, we could learn from?
Yeah, I think so. And I think we're highly visual. So I think I read somewhere that 75, 80% of the information that comes into our brain, or what we focus on, is through the eyes. So, it's kind of balancing out this awareness so that you use, you want to use your eyes, but you also want to use your ears a lot more. So I'm really super visual, and I have to write everything down and highlight it. So it's kind of funny. I'm a Jodo Shinshu Buddhist. I'm not that good at listening. I don't study well. I can't. I hear things, but I have to actually write them down and see. Once I write it down and I see it and I highlight it, then I've got it. Like when I learned Koji Fujiyama, I couldn't remember his name until I have to write it down. So there's different ways of learning, and you have to kind of become aware of how you kind of deal with the world around you. Okay, well, thank you very much. So we're going to do this again for the high school kids. And so the idea is all of us should be able to listen for 15 or 20 minutes to a Dharma. And it's an important skill even outside of Buddhism. You've got to be able to focus in college on a 2-hour lecture, right? And you have to be able to focus on a 3-hour final. And so, if you just focus on taking the test and you're not worrying about how you're doing, or so-and-so's turned the page before you did and you're falling behind, if you can just be in the moment and focus at the task at hand, it really is an important skill. Okay, thank you. Please join me in Gashi. Namo Amida Butsu. Namanda. Namanda. And I'll be here for a little while if anybody has any questions or comments. Thank you.